I'm Jane Ryan, and I'm interviewing Pat Micklow for the collection on the Women's Center history, the Women's Center in the Marquette area and the Marquette region. We are interviewing people who've had an important role to play or been served by the Women's Center, and we hope that Pat's experience and sharing her experience will add to the understanding of how we got this wonderful service in our region. Pat, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, Jane. I was born in Bessemer, not in Marquette, in 1937. I was the youngest of three daughters, and we moved to Marquette when I was in high school, the first year of high school. And it was like going to the big city for me from Bessemer. But I'd grown up trying to be the boy that my father was hoping to have. And I had a wonderful relationship with both my parents and my sisters, particularly my sister that was closest to me, 4.5 years older, Dorothy. And the oldest was Marilyn, and we were lived a very modest life when I was growing up. A lot of outdoor things. I fished and hunted with my father. Learned how to handle a gun then, and tied fishing flies. And I was on the girls' rifle team actually in high school. The first semester that I was in Bessemer. Well, actually, we lived in Ironwood for 1 year before we moved to Marquette. So I graduated from Graverette High School. It was called Graverette in those days, in 1955. I was married in 1956 and had my 3 children by the time I was 23 years old. My husband was, we both went to Northern. I went part-time while the children were small, which was unusual. I think I was the only pregnant woman at Northern at the time. And I started out majoring in home economics because I wanted to go into merchandising. But my life changed quite dramatically after I read The Feminine Mystique. And I think you'll find that all of us that were involved in this movement read that book, and it really did have an impact on our lives very dramatically. I think it galvanized us to really think about what our roles, not just as wives and mothers, was, but what was our role in the real world. And I did want to go on to college. As I said, I went part-time to Northern, and
Could you say what motivated you to feel that education was so important while you were coping with a young family?
Young family. I think it was my oldest sister Marilyn went to the University of Michigan and had to go by train from Bessemer. She was 9 years older than I was, but she was a real trailblazer in a lot of ways. And my parents had neither of them had a college education. They had some training. My mother had secretarial training, and my father had some dental lab training, and actually was a monument salesman while I was growing up in Bessemer and in Marquette. And later he worked for my husband, who was an orthodontist by that time, as a lab person. So there was no, they were always very supportive of us and always encouraged us a great deal with our studies, and were always interested in what we were learning. And I know my father always asked, well, what did you learn today when we came home from school? And so it just seemed like that was something I wanted to do. Plus, I had a big adventurous mind as a child, and I read all the Osa Johnson books about Africa, and for a while I wanted to be a nurse missionary, because at that time that seemed about the only way that I could get to Africa. And then another time I wanted to be a pilot. But I always wanted to do other things too, besides have a family and be a wife. And so in the late 60s, I believe it was around 68, we had returned here. My husband had finished his dental and orthodontic training in Ann Arbor, and we came back here in 1961. And then it must have been later than that. It was 63, I think. And that's when I started going to Northern part-time. And the friends that I had at the time were all like me, young mothers with some college education or maybe complete college education. There were a lot of women moving here with their husbands for Northern, and so being a student there, and a little bit older than the usual student, I was able to meet a lot of the wives too, and develop social relationship with them.
And it was a coming together, like you mentioned. A lot of these women had read about.
Oh yes,
yeah,
and they were, we were all pretty similar in a lot of ways, coping with trying to balance school or work and a young family, and yet realized that there were a lot of disabilities that women suffered from at that time when you looked around. I'm sure you've already heard about how you couldn't get a library card in your own name here at that time, and so that was one of our projects. We got that changed. I think Betsy Barnwell was the first one who got one in her name. And so we decided that we should look into this consciousness raising group that we were aware of was happening in certain parts of the country, and using the feminine mystique as our Bible at that time, started getting together. And I believe I did have the first meeting at my house, and that was in 1968. And it was a bit subversive, obviously, in those times. People would look at me and say, well, what's the matter with you? You've got a husband with a really good job and children, and, what's wrong with your life? And when we got together and started comparing notes, we found that all of us felt at times that we were, the expectations of what we would do with our lives was very limited. And it wasn't too hard to look around and see that, there were only certain professions that women were really welcomed into. There was only certain kind of work that was appropriate. And so we divided the group. I think we must have had at least 35 to 40 women at that first meeting.
And they would gather in homes, in your home?
Yes, and we gathered.
Oh my.
And so we decided we had to divide up into smaller groups, because that was obviously not possible to keep doing that. And so we divided into groups, and I right now don't really remember how we did that. If we went around the room and took a number, and did 1, 2, 3, and then 1, 2, 3, or whatever. But we had about 4 or 5 or maybe 6 groups going initially.
Did you have standard agendas, or was it just an occasion to be among
Together.
like-minded people, and somebody would bring up a concern, and you
Right.
very informal
And
then?
it was very informal, and it was very revealing. Some women felt that we had to meet in their basements because their husbands were not at all tuned into what we were doing and didn't want to be, or were not approving of it. Fortunately, my husband Bruce was very supportive at that time, and I didn't have a problem with that directly. But we did continue to meet, and we found it was so enervating to be able to share our concerns with each other, that it was
It was almost therapeutic.
therapeutic.
Yeah,
yes. And a lot of the women that hadn't grown up in the area, that had moved to the area, felt particularly isolated because they thought they were coming to the end of the world, which it kind of was at that time. And so it just opened up so much, and we heard about everybody's dreams and concerns and issues that affected everyone. Like, getting a bank account in your own name. We had some women in the groups that were really considering divorce for different reasons. And that was really a horrible decision. Of course, it never is a good decision or an easy decision to make, but it was complicated by the fact that, most women didn't even have a bank account in their own name or access to their the income for the family. So it started and it grew, and I think we were meeting at least once a week or maybe twice a month for those years, up until I think we met and continued to meet until '73 when I went to law school. But
Is that what led to that conference at Northern?
Yes.
This same group of consciousness raising involved women led, we've got to do more?
we've got to do
Yeah.
more, and we've got to reach our sisters. Very strong. I think Sisterhood is Powerful was another book that was out at that time by Robin Morgan, and there were a lot of feminist writers surfacing in different ways and on different topics at the time. And we were so idealistic, and we thought if we could just tell people how things should be, that they would go along with it. We were naive, and we were so galvanized about it. We just felt like we had a mission to change the world, and we were sure we would be able to do it. It was really amazing, and I think it spun off in so many different ways. The group that I was in had Holly Greer and Carolyn McDonald and Carlin Rapport and Audrey Hugerheide, who is she's no longer here, and she just died last year. She is Michelle Butler's mother. And we also had Betsy Barnwell, who died several years ago. Carolyn McDonald, I think I said. Lillian Heldreth came in a little later. Marion Kublin came in, I think during the time that I was gone, came into the group. But they continued to meet, and maybe not as frequently. But we decided that we needed to have a conference, and we met with the other women that were in other groups, and they were all enthusiastic about having this conference, about changing the role of women.
I've noted that the conference involved women outside the Marquette community. How did that outreach go? Were they doing consciousness
Well,
raising?
we as small groups went and talked in the community, and we got invited to go. I know I went to Houghton a couple of times, and I think others went to different parts of the UP.
So the community
They
people
were finding
aware,
out about it, and
Yeah.
and they wanted to know what we were doing.
sort of word of mouth. Do you
Word of
think
mouth,
you didn't
we
publicize?
didn't publicize. I remember at one meeting, I mean, I was pretty brash in those days, and I thought we should be marching down Front Street in Washington Street, you know, with feminist signs, and I think it caused some of our members to blanch. It maybe caused some of them to drop out because, you know, we were so enthusiastic and thought, we've got to get this message out. We've got to help our sisters and ourselves to change these parts of our roles that were not right. We never reached the point of burning bras or anything, even though I think we probably got tarred with that brush as being radicals at that time. I'm sure we did in some quarters, but you know, generally we were all active in the community. We all sat on different boards and were working or going to school, and our families were active, you know, so there was just...
That was a dramatic change locally that I think you've mentioned, or some have mentioned, Ginny Celine, who was active in the Democratic Party, and how she evolved to that. I've never
Ginny
heard.
was sort of our standard bearer. She was not involved, as I recall, in the consciousness raising group. She seemed like her consciousness was already raised. She was older than most of us. Most of us were in our early 20s at the time, or middle to late 20s. Mm-hmm. And so we just saw Ginny Celine and later Jerry DeFont as being our standard bearers that provided us with so much information politically, and they were so astute politically. Ginny was the chair of the Democratic Party at that time, and Jerry was the woman who, of course, organized the women for the Gossard factory and lingerie factory in Ishpeming, and with the Lady Garment Workers Union. I mean, that was
amazing and ironic that it would be lingerie.
Yes,
I think that's wonderful.
And that in itself is a wonderful story. That deserves a lot of attention because it was amazing what she did and how those women were able to get a better wages and better conditions as a result of that, better working conditions. But Ginny helped us politically, and she was my mentor for many years during that period. And at that time, I was having some concerns with my kids in high school. My oldest son in high school had a hair issue and was not allowed to play on the basketball team, even though he'd been the star as a freshman. And he had to have a crew cut. His hair was not long at that time. It was, you know, just normal.
Longer than...
It was longer than a crew cut, though. And the coach insisted on crew cuts, and that kind of galvanized my interest in education and what was happening in the schools. And I ended up running for the State Board of Education in 1971. I conducted a statewide campaign with Ginny, and Tom Baldini was my manager, and we went all over the state, and I wasn't successful because at the last minute the UAW, through their support that they had promised in a previous union as a union to a previous group, the Latinos, and I would have knocked off the only black incumbent on the whole ticket in '72 in the state. So I withdrew. But it put me in a very good position with the party. They always loved me after that. And I got a lot of appointments that I would probably not have, but for that. It was an amazing experience to do a statewide campaign, and I learned a tremendous amount. And
Did
I
that
enjoyed
connect
it.
up to your interest in
In
law
law.
then?
Yes, and by that time I had received, done my bachelor's and a master's at Northern. And I switched my major very early from home ec to
Political science?
literature.
Okay.
And then my master's was in history. And so that I realized that if I really wanted to make a difference for women in the future, that a law degree would really be helpful. Well, that helped me with getting into law school as well, that experience that I had.
So it really was connected to your interest in women's issues?
Yes.
You saw
Very
that as a
definitely.
role. That's interesting.
Very definitely. I felt, by this time I was very committed to making the world a better place for women. And our consciousness raising groups and the literature that we read and the encounters that we had trying to talk to people about feminism all kind of came together and launched me into realizing that with a law degree I might be able to really do something with it, with that passion that I had.
So that,
and still have.
Yeah, obviously. The chronology was that, though, just as the Women's Center would be launched, my understanding is pretty much from the conference, people said.
Yes.
Northern was
That
willing to
conference was
cooperate.
amazing.
Yeah. But then you were off to law school. Did you keep in touch with what was going on here? It would seem like once you're in law school, you're pretty focused on your studies.
Well, I tried to. And of course, in law school, I still wanted to do something. The University of Michigan Law School, at the time I started in 1973, had an accelerated course to go through law school. You could go 3 summers and 2 full years and get your law degree. And so it was very intense. And I was trying to commute as many times as I could on the weekends so I could be with my family. My husband was marvelous about it, and he went to all the basketball games. My daughter was the star basketball player on the Marquette's team that won the state championship while I was in law school. I got to go to some of her games and one of her final games, but there was just a great deal of work that I had in law school, just trying to keep in touch with my family, and that was another thing that was not very popular at that time. A lot of people just could not understand why I was leaving my family to go to law school. Even my parents-in-law and my parents were not real sure that that was a good idea. And
that, I'm sure, was a generational thing. I've heard so many comment that even, like your mom might have really admired, but hey, this is out of the track.
Yeah, this is not what you do, you know. And it was very revolutionary at the time. So my kids were all in school. My oldest son had graduated from high school in '73, and or it was in his last year of high school, and my second oldest son, Brock, Curtin Brock, Brock was in a junior when I went to law school, and Susan was in 8th grade, but already launched on as a freshman, she was on that team. And that was a little bit new, too. We didn't have women's basketball any time that I was growing up. And so she was very wonderful athlete, still is. And
Did you detect her admiration or her curiosity about what you were doing as a daughter versus sons? That's a whole nother subject. But
yeah, she has always been the kind of kid that just decides what she's going to do and she does it. Very straightforward, and very talented. And my kids had the horrible experience of losing their father. My father died. My husband Bruce died of a glioblastoma, brain tumor, in 1981. But his symptoms started just as I was finishing law school. He had his first grand mal seizure. And so those years when I returned to Marquette and my kids were all in college, it was a very tumultuous time because he was ill, and we understood that it was a terminal illness. So all of the kids their lives were dramatically affected more, I think, by that than the fact that I had been gone. And we just always operated as a team during that whole time. As I took him all over the country trying to find cures for his illness. And I think we expanded his illness. We were sailors. He was a very big sportsman, and we ended up taking two different boats of ours down to the Virgin Islands so that he could have time on the boat. And the kids took time off from college, and Susan had to change. She was on the golf team in University of Miami in Florida, and she left and came home. So there was a lot of turmoil there, and that was just after I finished law school.
yeah. So did you postpone then any use of your degree?
No. As it turned out, I was able to go. I did look around with civil law firms, but when I was in law school, I never dreamed about being a prosecutor or a judge. I mean, I always thought about being a woman fighting for women's rights in the civil courts. And I realized after law school, because my friend and colleague in law school, Sue Eisenberg, and I decided that we needed to have a research project. The University of Michigan Law School had, I think, about 15% of the students were women at the time. There was one black student in my class of 200 students. It was not an integrated school at that time. And we were not comfortable. There wasn't I know it's been quoted before, but there wasn't a women's bathroom in the main classroom building at the University of Michigan Law School at that time. So we weren't real comfortable. We realized that what they were looking for were corporate attorneys, and we didn't fit that mold in any way. There was one woman law professor, and she taught women in the law, and there was that class, and of course we took that. But when I had been in Marquette, I was on the Child and Family Services Board before I left for law school, and Lloyd Sidwell, who was the executive director at that time, said to me before a meeting one day, "You know, I don't know if it's just the UP or what, but it seems like just a huge percentage," he said, "it's probably like 80% of my caseload involves violence, domestic violence, wife beating. We didn't call it domestic violence right away. We called it wife beating.
And you didn't talk about it much in those
Oh,
days.
no. But then when you thought about
80%.
it, you realized that you'd heard stories of relatives or friends that were experiencing it. And at the time, Virginia Nordby, who was the one law professor, a woman law professor at U of M, was involved in the reform of all of the rape laws at the University of Michigan. And she was on the committee that was rewriting everything. And
Legislative changes?
For legislative changes, right. And Sue Eisenberg and I were good pals. Kind of
Where
hung
was
on to
Susan
each
from,
other.
as an aside?
She was from the Detroit area. Actually, she was from one of the suburbs, a wealthy suburb, and she's a terrific gal, and we just hit it off, and we were pals through law school. And I said, Lloyd Sidwell talked about wife beating, and we were looking for what we called a body issue. Rape was a body issue. Contraception, abortion, those were all body issues. But we were looking for something that we could get our teeth into and write about. So we decided, okay, we'll see if we could do a 12-hour research project, and let's see if we can do it on wife beating. Well, we went to Yale Kamazar, who is a very famous guy at the U of M Law School. He's written the textbooks on criminal procedure, criminal law, and he's the one that's always the commentator on national news whenever there's a big trial going on. I know he was a commentator for the trial of the big sports star that was accused of killing his wife. All of a sudden, I can't remember his name. There's probably a good reason for that.
Yeah.
I probably don't like to remember him. But anyway, we went up to him and told him that we were thinking of doing, that we were going to ask him to be our faculty advisor, which we would have to have. And we told him about what we were doing. And he looked at us and he said, "Oh, you must have been talking to my wife." And that did it for me and Susan. I walked away. We were outside walking with him, and on campus, and I just couldn't believe that he would say such a thing. It was so insensitive. We're saying this is a problem for women, and he's making a joke. So fortunately, Virginia Nordby, even with all of that she was trying to do, she agreed to be our faculty advisor. So we had little tape recorders, and we went to everybody we could think of that might come into contact with the problem in Wayne and Washtenaw counties. Susan covered most of the Wayne things because she was from Detroit area and she had contacts there. But we interviewed everybody from judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, psychologists, emergency room doctors, anybody we could think of that might have encountered the problem. And we recorded what they said. And it was absolutely mind-blowing. And we realized we had this tiger by the tail. That we got responses like the head of Detroit General's emergency room said, I don't really care if two people want to beat each other up. That's not my business. That's something they can take care of in their own relationship. we were able to meet with Legal Services in Ann Arbor, and they were so in favor of what we were doing that they helped get about 20 victims who agreed to talk to us.
Were there any defenders for these? I mean,
Well,
yeah,
they were
prosecutors at that time.
Well, the prosecutors that we talked to had waiting periods, that when a complaint came in, they made the woman sign it, first of all, and there was no way to immediately diffuse the situation, so they'd walk the guy around the block or something, or they'd try to see if the woman would go somewhere else, but often she didn't have anywhere to go. She had children.
So you were really clarifying this whole issue that nobody talked about.
Right. It was, I mean, I'm surprised we got through law school because it was an overwhelming issue. And we had other classes and lots of work, you know. And we decided, well, we'll write a law school article and see if we can get it published in the law school. And we did, and we called it Wife Assault, Catch-22 Revisited. And we got a lot of publicity locally in Ann Arbor at the time, and it launched the first women's shelter in Ann Arbor.
In Ann Arbor.
By the NOW organization. The National Organization of Women was very active in Ann Arbor. Very strong group of women there. And they gave us the Uppity Women Award at the time.
Were they, boy, this is in a way a tangent, but was the NOW group there aware of the issue as much as, so they really liked the fact you had clarified it, pulled it together in a paper?
Well, and the Ann Arbor News did a feature story on our article. And that's what got their attention. I mean, we really weren't, we knew the laws had to be reformed. And the big thing was, is there a way that the perpetrator could be removed from the home by arrest immediately? And we knew, because misdemeanor arrests, you can't do that. You couldn't do that under the law, and you still can't today for most misdemeanors. It's not an immediate arrest. But there were so many laws that were impacted. All of the personal protection orders we learned from the victims. One woman was, took out a personal protection order to keep her husband from beating her, and he made her eat it after it was served on him. Physically made her eat it. It was not enforceable. There were no criminal penalties for violating it, and so it was useless, you know. And of course, a hearing was always available, still is today, after the fact, but there was no way that these women would go in and testify in a hearing and then get beaten up when they got home. And there were no shelters, except we had been, and this was happening, and I'm sure all over the world it happens, where neighbors or friends take her in, you know, to give her some
risk
safety
to themselves.
But there were no shelters for women suffering from the effects of domestic violence. So we looked at all the laws in Michigan at the time, and that was the basis of our paper, that were affected by that needed changing. Another one was, it didn't need changing, but it needed to be publicized, was the law that was on the books at the time about non-accidental injury. And that was interpreted by hospitals and doctors and nurses to be gun or knife wounds. But even if someone came in badly beaten with broken bones, and usually the women were afraid to say who did it, they still did not, there was still no mechanism for calling the police and saying what happened here. This is a serious non-accidental injury.
You need to investigate
You
this.
need to investigate this. So there were all kinds of those kinds of laws that were not effective, and the intervention we found at that time was totally ineffective. I mean, if they called the police couldn't remove the perpetrator. If they went to the hospital, nobody called the police. Nobody gave them any protection. If they filed for a personal protection order, that was useless. If they called the police and they would have to go, there was a waiting period the prosecutors would ask them for, and they'd have them come in 10 days to 2 weeks later to make sure, because most of these women, the experience of prosecutors was that they wouldn't follow through, and they set it up for trial and through the system, and then they wouldn't testify, and they would make them sign the complaint. Well, that was one of the first things we wanted to get changed, is prosecutors don't make these women sign these complaints, because you don't do it for other forms of crimes. Other crimes you don't have to sign. Why do you have to do it here? It puts her right on the firing line. And so those things were really important, and that was the basis of our paper, was pointing out all of the various assaults that could occur, the malicious destruction of property. That was a very common thing that we were finding.
An impact on children.
Yeah, impact on children, and mistreating the child in the household, or having them witness it. We knew from the psychologists that had long-lasting effects. Mistreatment of the pets in the house, killing the dog if she complains, killing the cat, in gruesome ways sometimes. We were just astounded. And at the time that crime statistics were being kept, that was another thing. It didn't tell if it was by an intimate or not. So you didn't know if it was a husband that killed a wife. You just knew it was a homicide. So that was another thing that needed changing.
And
it was
you need documenting to get legislation.
Yeah.
Often people say, well, it's not an issue.
It was system-wide.
Yeah.
And it was so buried, and the prevailing idea was you keep your marriage together and you do not complain, and you made your bed, you lie in it. In fact, we had some of the people we interviewed say, they made their bed and let them lie in it, that kind of stuff.
Mm.
And it was just like it wasn't there, and it wasn't talked about, and it brought such shame on the victims. If they complained, it affected everybody's perception of them. And by the time they might have complained to somebody, they were so beaten down that they believed it was their fault. It was just a horrible, horrible situation.
Having written this, and you'll tell maybe more about getting it published, but you would want to get out and do something about it, and that wouldn't be easy to do, would it? I mean, did that take awesome steps to
really
educate
did.
and...
It really did. But we had some friends in the legislature, and by the way, our paper was not published at the University of Michigan Law School. We brought it to the Reform Legal Journal, and it was all male staff that reviewed it, and they wrote in the margins so many sarcastic things about "you got to be kidding," that kind of stuff, that we were absolutely devastated and thought, this is not going to work here. And it wasn't until 1977 that we were contacted, and after we had an article in Ms. Magazine and had some publicity on this, that someone from Rutgers University, they had a women's rights law reporter at that time, and they offered to publish our article. And so we worked with them, and it was published in 1977 at Rutgers.
Well, I'm hoping very much that we can get the Ms. Magazine article and your paper to add to the archives, if you can help us.
I have the paper. It's a little faded, the cover on it, but it turned out to be the first legal article that was published in the United States on domestic violence.
Well, we're lucky that you are
It
here
really
and
turned
we're
out,
motivated.
It turned out to be that, and there has been so much wonderful work done since then in with legal articles by women students and men, that it's just hard to remember how bad it was at that time. I mean, we did a search of the literature before we started our writing, of course, and couldn't find anything. And in the University of Michigan Law Library and the regular library, there was nothing on the laws, you know. So anyway, when we graduated, Sue went and got a wonderful job in Washington, D.C. with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And she worked there for several years before she returned, and she's in private practice and is in Detroit area, and she is a leading light on employment discrimination against women cases. She's had some very large cases that she has settled and made tremendous strides for women on. I came back and had no intention of leaving the area because my family was here, and I applied for work in the prosecutor's office. It dawned on me, there's a place that I could help. We got to start working with prosecutors and judges and probation officers and everybody that's involved in these cases.
You were in the trenches when you were there.
Yeah. And Gary Walker was the prosecutor, a fairly new prosecutor at that time, and he hired me, bless his heart. He told me he had no intention of hiring me because he didn't think I needed the work. My husband had a good job.
Classic statement.
Yeah, but I guess in the interview I talked him out of it, and he hired me, and I was the first woman assistant in this office, and I think probably in the UP at that time. There were no women in prosecutors' offices at that time.
And I can remember living here. That's the beginning, and that's part of this process. You were a model. Somebody could see a woman in those jobs, and as you moved up, which you'll tell us more about, if she can do it, maybe I can do it. Those modeling things are so important for any group of people that are moving out of their normal.
And there were, I just really treasure the times that I've had women come up and say to me, I went away to school because of you, or I went into law because of you, or I went into another profession, you know, and that has meant a lot.
You're making a difference. Yeah, that's wonderful. Just wonderful.
It makes me have a little trouble keeping back the tears because it's something that you just can't believe that you were instrumental in helping to change lives.
And that it takes for changes to take place, some people have to step beyond and make the change so that others who might not have the courage or maybe quite the talent say, no, if I work hard, I can do this. I can get this job, or I can continue my education, which again leads us back to the Women's Center, because that's what it did locally to empower. I love that term, empower women or whomever.
And and it was such a remarkable group. And I have felt over the years, I've always been so proud of us and this community, because, well, the Women's Center is still the oldest continuously operating center in the state, and we think possibly in the nation. It has been absolutely such a kernel of growth and strength and leadership in this community. And it all started with those consciousness raising groups and in the Women's Center and the leadership. I mean, the women that rose out of that, there's so many. It wasn't just me, that's for sure. I was only a small part of it. And it continues today.
Right, and they went into different walks of life, political, education,
all kinds of different professions and things that they did in their own ways.
And my understanding, too, because we've tended, as we've looked at some of the not so good things that happened because of the influence of men and kind of the standard things, but my understanding in this community, we had some men in key places, the prosecuting office, other places who were willing, again, to step out of the normal.
To take a chance.
Take a chance.
And
could
you describe
one of those?
Because that is really true. I mean, the amount of negative stuff that we've had happen is far outweighed by the number of men that said, "You're right, we need these changes. We can see that we need these changes." Gary Walker was instrumental in getting a huge grant for the Women's Center at a very crucial time for federal security monies through the Prosecutors Association and everything. It was a $1.5 million grant. And there were men in all the different fields that were trying to help, that just did groundbreaking things. They started anger management courses that the courts could send convicted perpetrators to.
And education was a part of it, both on those part and on the part of these men who culturally thought it was okay. I mean, we're dealing with that internationally. If it's a part of your culture and nobody said no,
you can't do it.
So,
and that was it. Nobody said no. And now you would have men stepping in and say, "This, you even see it on the TV cop shows, that they threaten these guys. If you ever touch her again, you're going to deal with me," and that kind of thing. I mean, there was never that understanding
or that line drawn,
and that line drawn.
And wasn't a key element, I don't know if that was a grant or what, you might have been involved, where people were trained to ride with the police, or when there was a case that these people who knew how to help the woman go through either the rape situation or the abuse, so that
a lot of that was happening while I was in law school and gone, but they did ride-alongs. They developed a crisis sexual assault team that would go to the hospital, make sure the rape kit was done, made sure that the woman knew that there was services for her, and that there was shelter for her if she needed it. And the spouse abuse shelter at that time was a separate organization from the Women's Center. It wasn't merged until 1986. And then the Women's Center took over the whole domestic violence shelter area. But
So
those
you
women
have,
were key in setting up the groundwork and working. There's so many agencies involved. You know, there's mental health. There's all of the helping agencies, the psychologists, the psychiatrists. There's the substance abuse people. There were so many groups that we had to be in touch with and network with, and it taught a lot about networking. And I remember thinking when I was in law school, I was appointed, or after I finished law school, I was appointed to the State Domestic Violence Prevention and Treatment Board, which was formulated in 77. And prior to that, I was on the Joint Legislative Advisory Board for Domestic Violence. And we're the ones that made the recommendations to the legislature to change the laws. I was a co-chair of that.
did that legislation for the most part
And that got passed in 78. And we changed a myriad of laws and established the Domestic Violence Prevention and Treatment, the board, the Domestic Violence Prevention and Treatment Board. It's a very hard acronym to say. And we set up, we provided funding through federal and state funding sources for shelters across the state, in addition to working to improve the education on all these changed laws. Immediate arrest if there's reasonable cause. No waiting periods. You know, we couldn't legislate those, but we could work with the Prosecuting Attorneys Association, which we did, to change those
network
waiting
to
periods.
get? Yeah.
No signing of the complaints. Criminal penalties for violation of personal protection orders. Looking at the Michigan, or the state police way that they kept their statistics, getting intimate partners is a category. There were just, I'm probably missing some. My memory is
I'm amazed. No, I'm amazed your memory. This is very.
But it was very extensive, and I remember thinking at the time that we started meeting, we would go and visit these shelters that had been set up while I was on the board, and that was up into the early '80s. And I thought, this is absolutely fantastic, because these women shelter directors were phenomenal. They were phenomenal fundraisers, networkers. It provided an executive class of women with jobs that they could really get into. And they came up with, providing ways to bring in funds so they could fund their services. I remember one of them in Detroit had a fashion show with the Detroit Pistons as the models, and they brought in tens of thousands of dollars for that night. I mean, it was incredible. They had, they set up second-hand stores as part of their operations, which we do here with pack rats, and just very innovative ways of bringing in money and educating their communities and providing services, amazing services to women.
And I always go back to the modeling thing. Then somebody coming to that agency sees a woman in charge who's efficient, knows how to network, knows how to raise money. Hey, there's a niche, and she can move on up the ladder, and maybe I can do a job like this.
That's right. That's right. They were, it just tickled me. I mean, I thought, wow, this is something, you know. And it wasn't long before we had shelter coverage in every county in Michigan. All 73 counties, we had shelter coverage.
So you were doing two things. You were working at the state level on some of these things while you were in the prosecutor's office, and then go on with your career a little bit, and then how you reconnected her, because I know you're active on the board
Okay.
now.
I think I'm taking too long.
No, this is wonderful.
But in the prosecutor's office, Gary, of course, was a very good supporter, and he had no problem getting rid of the waiting the waiting period, or in fact, they hadn't always used it very thoroughly in Marquette County. He also held a lot of sway with the other prosecutors in the UP and in the state. He eventually was the president of the Prosecuting Attorneys Association. And so he had a lot of contacts, and so we were able to, we took away the woman signing it. That was not done. And he let me spend time with women victims. There was not yet set up the victim witness advocates that are now in every prosecutor's office under the Victim Crimes Act in Michigan. That came later. It probably came in the 80s, early 80s. So it was early. And some of the other colleagues of mine in the office were not real sure that this was good. They said I was turning the prosecutor's office into a social work agency. And we had to work out some things periodically, but it did come together. And they all understood the issues. I worked during that time with the state court administrator's office holds trainings for prosecutors and probation officers and judges, and I was an instructor at the state level for some of those, and also Soapy Williams was on the Supreme Court at that time, and he was such a sweetheart. And I called him and said, there is a pilot program that one of the eastern states, I don't know if it was, I want to say Maryland. They want Michigan to partner with them to put on a pilot program for training judges. And I said, since the Supreme Court supervises all the judges in the country, I said, is that something that we could do? He said, of course, Pat, of course. You let me know what we need to do, and we'll do it. And so we joined with Maryland, and we had a huge conference in California, and I was one of the trainers, and it turned out that we had several meetings out there, but it turned out that the main one that I was involved in, my father died while I was gone, and I had to leave. I was unable to stay for it, but it was an amazing thing, because it was pulling in all the states in the late 70s, early 80s. It had passed similar laws across the country on domestic violence. And then we all realized the education had to go with it, and these people in key positions that were making decisions about these cases had to be involved.
Had to know about them, and also had to overcome what might be resistance. Because we're still...
And there was resistance, It wasn't the way things were done. And these cases tended to take a lot of time and energy on the part of police, prosecutors, probation officers, judges. I mean, they're not easy cases. They're complicated. And often the victim or survivor will go back and everything falls apart. I mean, there were two sides to that story of court reform, and it was discouraging to many, and it took a lot of getting used to thinking a little bit differently about those cases, and that maybe these are important cases that need that amount of attention.
Exactly, and your comment about becoming a social service agency,
Yeah.
well, they needed an element
An element
of that where people were looking beyond the strict letter of the law, but human beings
as
learning
well.
to have a relationship that's healthy or not.
And during those years, it was so exciting to see so many women coming out of law school and other professions and inundating these systems and helping to make sure that the educational issues were being done. I mean, you could see it. I could see it. I was just so overcome by how much that took hold when it did, and now it's a household word. It's an institution, actually, which it was very hard to see in '73 that it would ever be that.
Yeah.
That it would ever have that elevation within our culture. And so much has happened, and so many women and men have had a hand in developing that and developing the procedures. We added stalking, which turned out to be a really difficult criminal issue. And so there are just so many things that have happened over the past.
These are exciting times to have lived.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the whole area of civil rights. Yeah, we have
Yeah.
a long way to go. We still have a long way to go, but a lot has happened.
Major changes.
Now, I do want you to go back to your own career. You're in the prosecutor's office. What led you to take on an election and judgeship and then reconnect back?
Well, my first husband died in 1981 while I was in the prosecutor's office at that time. I had met my future husband at that time through the Prosecuting Attorneys Association. He was a prosecutor in Jackson at the time and had worked in Lansing and different parts of the state, downstate. And he was placing interns in prosecutors' offices to help them recruit people that would be interested in being prosecutors. Sure, I'll have any more tea. Anyway, he placed an intern in our office, and he was a friend of Gary's, and so I met him in the office. But the following year, I went to the Prosecuting Attorneys Association on Mackinac Island conference, and he was there, and we kind of hit it off. And a year later, we were married. And Gary had an opening, and so he came up here and was assistant prosecutor in the Marquette County office. And so we worked together for a couple of years in the office, but he said, you ought to run for judge. Because at the time that my first husband was so ill, I had taken on, instead of being a criminal prosecutor, I asked Gary if I could do the civil work. And so I was the attorney for the Board of Commissioners, and I think we had 33 other county commissions and boards that I supervised, and I also helped with townships. And I was on television every week for the meetings. Or every other week, I guess it was, I don't remember. But I didn't have a trial schedule to try to deal with when he was so ill. And so that was the position I was in when my husband Judd was hired. He was in the criminal division. I was in the civil division. And there I also had contact with the family support unit, which there were things in that area that with custody issues and so forth that domestic violence also affected. So I had my hand in it in that way too. But I had never considered being a judge. But I was in a perfect position to be able to do that.
And could you see the connection to the issues
The
that you
circuit-
continued to be?
The district court, which is the position I ran for, had two judges at the time. One was in Ishpeming, and one was in Marquette. And the one in Ishpeming used to call me honey from the bench when I appeared in his court. So I knew he wasn't terribly enlightened. The other judge was a very wonderful scholar, a very nice guy, and a civil rights person. He really, I thought was going to be very formidable. And there was a little incident with the Bar Association that caused me to not feel quite so bad about running against him. His term was up. And he had been in office for 2 terms of 6 years, so he'd been in there 12 years. The Bar Association, the local Bar Association, wanted to return having strippers at their annual bar banquet. And I think Pre Burnham and I were the only attorneys, women attorneys at that time. Maybe Carolyn Hansen. And I was the only woman at the Bar Association meeting where this was discussed, I know. And they thought it was cute because they were going to have both male and female strippers that they would hire from Escanaba. And they would renew this old thing that they used to do at somebody's camp. And I was aghast, and my husband Judd was aghast, and some of the other attorneys were aghast. This is a professional organization, and you're going to have strippers? And I remember standing up and saying, I'm really uncomfortable about, I don't think we should do anything that would have any of our members feel uncomfortable. Well, that didn't go over. Nobody responded. So then Wim McDonald said, well, I remember the days when we could entertain ourselves, and I'd make a motion that we don't pay for any entertainment. And the motion passed, but not by much. And the sitting judge that I ended up running against voted against it. And I thought, that's not good. I mean, because he's a public employee. He's answerable to the people of Marquette County and the state of Michigan. And how could he possibly vote to have strippers at an annual bar banquet? So I didn't feel quite so bad about running. It's not a story that I've told many people, and I have the deepest respect for him and the work he did. But it did make me realize that there was just a lot to be done yet, and that maybe I could be helpful in a judicial position. So I did run, and I did win, and I served 14 years on the bench. I then had the opportunity not of charging cases like I had in the prosecutor's office when I was doing the criminal cases, but I also had now the opportunity to look at these cases and how they were disposed of, and what would happen. And I instituted public apologies to the victims, but that was in all criminal cases. In the district court, it's like 90% criminal work. Every criminal case in the county starts in the district court. Bond is set there. And so we instituted putting bond conditions of no contact with the victim, which if it happened and it was reported to the police, they could arrest him and jail him.
That was a very strong consequence that had links back to what you had discovered way back.
Exactly.
No consequence.
Yep, yep.
Excellent.
And we also learned with the personal protection orders that if they were going to blow up, they were going to blow up soon after they were granted. Now the circuit court granted those, but we enforced them in the district court if there were violations. So we worked with police and our police and our prosecutors and our probation officers, if there was a no contact order as an order of probation, another thing. And always we're looking out for where it was really appropriate to, you know, put whatever we could on those conditions of bond or probation.
And I think that, you know, your evolution through all these roles, bringing the education you'd gotten is just a perfect fit.
It really turned out to be.
Yeah.
And I realized that it would be the way to go, you know. And I really didn't think I was going to win when I ran. I mean, I loved campaigning, and I think I did have an advantage because I think my colleague, the incumbent judge, was shy guy. He's very brilliant, and he was very able, but he used to talk really fast, and people didn't always understand what he said in court, and they'd come out and say, "What did he say?" And so it seemed to me that we had to take time and really let them know from the bench that this was inappropriate behavior. And so I tried to do that. And I don't know how well I did with it. It's hard to say. But I tried to make them understand that that was just not acceptable behavior when I was
which is, again, such an evolution from when it wasn't even
yeah.
described. It
Yeah.
was described. So were you aware then, I need to get back to the Women's Center, were you aware of the goings-on, but you were, particularly as a judge, you have to be careful about commitment to
Right.
causes and
I,
things.
I think I was on the Women's Center board, as I recall, when I was in the prosecutor's office. I was on it for a while. Because when I did win election as a judge, I had attorneys wanting me to recuse myself from cases involving domestic violence because I was on the Women's Center board. And I got off the board when I was elected. And I refused to do that because I had to be able to see both sides. And I did see both sides. I mean, I did see the problems on each side. And I certainly tried to be a compassionate but fair judge.
Well, and a male judge wouldn't be asked to recuse himself because he belonged to some men's club,
Yeah,
you
right,
know, or
exactly.
organization. That's
I always didn't appreciate that, but I would tell them, no, I am no longer on that board. That is not an issue. And so rather than invoke my ire more, they would usually drop the matter instead of appealing it. I don't think I had any appeals on that. But anyway, so while I was a judge, it was really, really interesting to be able to work on the disposition of these cases. And I did sit on the circuit bench periodically to substitute. And I did have some cases that involved sexual assault, but I don't think I had any domestic violence ones, but it was sexual assault between intimates. Is really domestic violence too. We just characterize it separately because it doesn't always mean that, but most sexual assaults do occur between people who know each other. And that's the same thing with and domestic violence. We extended it to the dating relationship or living in the same home.
Abode, yeah.
I mean, it got expanded to include boyfriends or significant others.
And occasionally it's spousal abuse of the man by the female. I mean,
Right.
that's much, as I understand
Yes.
it, much less common,
That
but
does
you don't
happen.
rule out the thinking
No.
this can happen.
In fact, when we were more flush at the Women's Center, we would put those men up in a hotel because we couldn't put them in the shelter with the other women, but we could put them up in a hotel for a period of time. We haven't had funds to do that recently. But I was always aware of what the Women's Center was doing, and we often had women's advocates from the Women's Center in the courtroom. That was very common during preliminary examinations, during bond hearings, during
To support the woman
to
who's...
support the woman. And even if the woman wasn't there or didn't need to be there, or for trial. And I did have trials involving domestic violence at the misdemeanor level, not at the felony level. So it was very interesting and challenging because you could see that we still had ways to go. You know, there were always new personalities, new police coming in, or new.
The education process goes on.
Education process
Well,
had to
and
go on.
one of the wonderful things about a community like ours is to have somebody who's been connected, knows the community, has a new role with different powers or decision making, but still can relate to what's going on, the networking
Yeah.
syndrome. And we are so fortunate here, and I think it's shown up with a lot of the other people who've been involved in the Women's Center, that they've had another role to play in the community, and they bring that knowledge, understanding, experience into their other roles.
Yes, and
vice versa.
That's so important.
Yeah.
It's so important because you have to integrate it into your life. You know, your values.
So now you're back on the board.
So
And how did that happen?
Well, I retired from the bench in 2001, and my husband and I both retired. At that point, he was a federal prosecutor here in the office in Marquette, and we both retired. And then we've traveled quite a bit and started to have time enjoying our grandchildren. And 3 years ago, in July, be three years ago this coming July it'll be, so it's 2 years ago July, I was approached by Sally and Matt Weesey and Carlin and some of my friends saying that the Women's Center was having some very strong challenges and issues, and would I meet with them, and we met, and it evolved into us setting up a whole new board with the permission of the previous board. And the previous board elected us as the new board members, and we we had a board of I think about 8 of us, with Martha Parks as our president, and they elected me treasurer at a meeting that I wasn't at.
Classic.
Yeah, which
Board behavior.
was one of the major problems we had was financial, and we had some structural organizational issues as well. And Phyllis Loonsfoot was our wonderful director and still is. But she was handling like 3 jobs because the previous board had found it necessary to reduce staff, and it was just very difficult time. And so 4 of us, the founding mothers. Well, Holly came on last year after she moved here from New York, moved back to Marquette. But yes, Carlin and Sally and I were some of the old founding mothers.
Yeah, I love that term. We've used that before. It's perfect.
And they welcomed us with open arms, and so we were back on the board, and we had a lot of work to do, and a lot of challenges that needed to be met. And one of the main ones was reconnecting with the community. There had been some issues that had caused the previous board to back off quite a bit and not continue with a capital campaign to fund the new harbor house that was opened in 2006.
And Sally had chronicled in that thing that the funding after 9/11, apparently a lot of federal and state grants had to be directed toward counterterrorism and all of those connected issues, so that
That's
some of
right.
the things the Women's Center had
Had
depended
counted on.
upon, gone.
Exactly.
Like the rug pulled out from under you.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
It must have been
And
very challenging.
We had really become disconnected from the community. And there were reasons for that. I mean, the previous director, there were reasons that happened, you know, but we were amazed that we didn't have a donor list to use that was anywhere close to being up to date. It wasn't even existent.
So you almost had to start from
We
scratch?
had to start from scratch on that. And we had to reconnect with all the various community organizations. And we're still doing that.
But
I
there's
think
been a
we've
lot of
done
progress.
lot. Yeah, I think we've been able to do a lot. We are hoping to, we've got a pending grant that I don't want to give away, but it would, it's designed to pay off the Harbor House mortgage, which would put us in a beautiful shape. But we have developed other businesses, like our Pack Rats is doing beautifully, our secondhand furniture and clothing store that is housed on the South Front Street. We have a marvelous director there of that, Nikki. She's spectacular in what she can do to bring people in, and all the funds that are garnered from that operation go to support Harbor House and the Women's Center programs. We also rent out a lot of our space, thanks to Sally and her husband Phil, who's done more than enough to get those spaces ready. We have Superior Fitness in one part. We have Superior Rehabilitation Services in another suite of rooms. And the Dia de los Tacos owner, Mike Walker, who is Gary's son actually, rents our kitchen to prepare his tacos, and of course has space in our parking lot for his truck when he's not using it.
And occasionally serves the product at meetings.
Yes. Well, we haven't. He's gone at noon hour all the time, so he's got his spots around town. But he's helped us we had a live remote that Eagle Radio and Rosemary Smith and her operation has helped us so much. We had invited people in for open house in October for the second year. We did that, and they bring things in and they help us get some of the larger items. Like last year we got a complete on-demand water heater as a result of that, free for Harbor House.
And connect me again, how did that happen?
With this live remote. The
Remote?
radio station is with us for 2 hours, and we're inviting people to come in, and they hear us on the radio, and we tell them a couple of items that we really need that are large ticket items. And this year we got a new washing machine. In fact, we got two. We needed a washing machine for Harbor House. The old one was dying, and that brought it in. Again, from the community.
And
The
people
community is absolutely marvelous. I mean, I couldn't ask for a more beautiful, giving, interested, dedicated community than we have. And people are there. It's just a matter of connecting with them.
Oh, I understood the renovation of both the building and Harbor House. A lot of it was donated.
Oh,
Unions
yes.
helping.
So much.
Again, Marquette is awesome.
They are. I think, I have my own theory about that, but I really think it's the size of the community and the varied, having the university and the hospital here, and the great mixture of people from all walks of life. You're not relegated to your professional group, which I think happens in larger
Bigger
cities. You are with everybody. It doesn't matter. And of course, our wonderful recreation and bike paths, thanks to Holly, in the city, all those things have worked together so that we have such a core of people from all walks of life that are together and connected.
In closure, you've actually alluded to some of the things going forward, but what would be your hope or dream in evolving either the Women's Center, spousal abuse, or programs, just maintaining? Are there things we're not doing that we should be working toward? What's your thought
Well,
on
I
that?
think our dream would be for the founding mothers to be able to get off the board at some point.
Draw in some new
We need
board members.
some young, dynamic, committed board members. The younger ones would be wonderful, and we have some younger ones on there now that we're very delighted to have. Melissa Adamson, who's the head of the Medical Care Access Coalition, she's a director, and we have Ellen Weingarten, who is with Marisa, and they all have a lot of experience and a lot of energy. We have Jen Lammy, Jennifer Lammy, who was the financial person for the Regional History Museum when they were building their facility, but she's now the executive director for the, I think it's the Upper Peninsula Builders Exchange.
I think it might be good to talk to some of these young women. We're talking history, but to see what their awarenesses are of how this all began.
Yes.
Because one of the motives behind these archives, and we parallel it with the civil rights movement, is after 40 years, the generation of younger women may take a lot of these progressive things for granted, that they've always been there, that you didn't. And so part of the archival and the discussion is let them know what it took and what we're going to need from younger people to continue progress.
Yes, that's going to be very important. It's going to be very important to have the younger generations of women take hold, and there are a lot of them out there. I mean, a lot of them are just too darn busy, and I understand that completely. You know, with young families and working difficult jobs, it's very hard. And it's, you know, we're retired, all of us, but I mean the founding mothers anyway. But it's hard. We also have Maggie Morgan, who is was the Hiawatha Land organizer and director for many years. Wonderful source of energy and ideas, and she has an absolutely wonderful sense of humor. which has really helped us.
We need that. We need that.
Yeah.
Well, this is hopeful. This is good things.
And then as far as programming is concerned, what I would love to see is for us to be able to get rid of all of our mortgage. We do have another $310,000 on the building, the South Front Street building. And if we could get rid of those mortgages, if we could hire some more staff. I cannot stop this interview without talking about our staff. Phyllis Loonsfoot is absolutely incredible leader, and the staff is phenomenal. They all are. They have worked under very difficult circumstances for many years. They haven't had a pay raise until this year. They have. They're so dedicated and they work so hard, but we really have limitations on our services as a result. We just cannot move forward with anything more until we have more funding and more staff.
So that really is the crux right now for the next year's.
We'd like to have services for women beyond domestic and sexual assault violence. And we do have some things, but our staff is now working on trafficking. They're making presentations locally and have been trained statewide to do workshops on that. And it's another big problem. It's another ugly part. We had a case in Marquette County.
And people tend to think it doesn't happen
They don't
here.
think it happens here.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of other things that we'd like to be able to help women with,
And
like
program-
retirement, like helping with job creation, job development, those kinds of things. We used to do that, but we're not able to now.
That was what I was going to say. When you look at the history, there were a lot of programs like working with young women in schools, talking about dating situations or whatever.
Well, we still have those programs going on with our staff in the schools. Yeah, we still do. The dating violence is going on. But maybe there's probably a lot more that could be done in those areas. So.
Well, I commend you for your contributions all along the way, and thank you for participating in this project, because I think we're all going to learn from hearing you, the other founding mothers, staff, and people who've benefited from the programs. I think when we can talk to more of them to hear how it really, because I know from a few of the stories it's life-changing to have connected with a women's center. So thank you, Pat.
Well, thank you, Jane. I've been blessed to be able to be a part of it.